Thank you for coming to the ArcGIS Pro SDK for .NET Tech session. Today we're going to talk about intermediate pro customization with a focus on mapping and layout APIs. Next to me is Uma Rano. She's on the Pro SDK team, as well as me, Wolf Kaiser. You'll see us on GeoNet, so if you have any questions while you're working, go on GeoNet, and if the question's not answered already, go ahead and ask us. Needless to say, while you're here, you can come and see us at the island, and we'll answer your questions or help you solve your workflow issues, your implementation issues. Quick session overview. We'll talk about the map tool first, which is our base class in the API for interactions with map views. The map tool is used for selection and identify in this specific tech session. Then we'll address some advanced user controls, which use MVVM, model view, view model, programming patterns. We're going to dive a little bit into MVVM because for you to be able to effectively code in the Pro SDK, you need to know some of the MVVM key concepts. So we'll explain to you a little bit data binding, the I-command pattern, multi-threading considerations in the ArcGIS Pro SDK, and finally styling and themes, so you can integrate and seamlessly blend your add-in look and feel to the Pro style. Finally, Uma is going to show us a little bit how to create layouts, something that's new in 2.3, the spatial map series, using the ArcGIS Pro API. And then specifically, she's going to show us the layout class, how to create page layouts, using layout elements to provide content, and then she'll delve into the spatial map series as well. So map interaction, so usually if you have a somewhat advanced control, what you do is you interact with your map, you use a map tool to that, and then you display the results in a more advanced UI. Sometimes you just display, columns and rows with your data detail, or sometimes you do a little bit analysis. So this little dock pane on the left, which we're going to go through later in a little demo, you can see it does both. It shows a table control, grid control. You can see the data that's being selected. At the same time, below you see a little analysis where it compares the number of records in specific feature layers. So first to the map tool. Map tool is a base class that represents a tool to perform interactive operations with a map view. So it's used to create custom tools, specifically for either selecting records, identifying, or editing. The map tool API base class provides virtual methods for keyboard and mouse events, which you can change if you need to. It also provides properties to set the default behavior on left click to create a sketch. Then we have the virtual sketch complete and the sketch canceled methods. And we'll see that in detail. How do you create a map tool? You would use the ArcGIS Pro map tool item template to generate all needed code for you. So you don't have to code any of this. As you know, if you use our project and item templates, they will stub out all the code that you need, and you just fill in content as needed. So the stubbed out code here, you can see it created a map tool 1 class for you. It derives from the map tool base class. So you will get all the behavior and properties that are implemented in the map tool base class of the API. In your constructors, there's some popular properties that you can override. Mostly I'm interested in the sketch type. This is where you can program what type of geometry you want to sketch. In my case, it's set to rectangle, but you can, set it to point, polygon, line, whatever is available. Excuse me. The sketch output mode is the kind of projection that will be used. And here, it's kind of important. You can use map in 2D. If you want your map tool to work in both 3D and 2D, you have to set the sketch output mode to screen. So use screen coordinates if you want to work in both 2D and 3D. We'll see that in a little example later. And then here's the on-sketch complete async. Everything is stopped out for you. The override, you can just put in your own custom code. You will get passed in the geometry that was sketched. So again, here's the sketch callbacks. The callback with the sketch geometry occurs after the sketching is completed. So if you come from the ArcObjects world, there is no need to rubber band feedback via the mouse move, etc., that you had to do with ArcObjects. The sketch geometry is the parameter of the callback. And below, you can see a little sample of that. I overwrote the existing stopped out content with my own custom code. Specifically, I take the sketch geometry and select all features that are intersected by the sketch geometry. I do this in using the select features call by just passing it the geometry. I get returned a selected set, and then I can use that selection to zoom. In this case, I zoom asynchronously, but I could just zoom to selection. And I give it that selected set and specify a little delay so I can get a visual feedback when it's doing the selection. And I set a few other parameters on the selection. We'll see that in a second, because here's our first demo. And what I just described to you, we're going to do in this first demo. Okay, I'm starting with Visual Studio. We support 17 and 15. And I think in April we'll support, is it April? We'll support 19, Visual Studio 19. So I'll start by creating a add-in first. So I do that by using a file new project. I select the module add-in. That just gives me an empty add-in. There's no user interface, nothing. It's just an empty add-in. All the code is stopped out for me automatically. And if you've seen our beginning session, you probably know what the config.daml is. That's our declarative markup language that describes all the user interface elements that we have in the Pro UI. In this case, I have nothing. All is empty. So what I do now is I have to use the item templates, add new item, and I drill down to my ArcGIS Pro add-ins, and here's all the items that I can insert. And I'm going to use the map tool here to demonstrate to you the map tool. By default, class is map tool 1. I can just leave it at that. So here's my stopped out code. So this is where I make my first change. Instead of rectangle, let's say I want to do a polygon. And then because I want to support 3D, I'm going to change the map to screen. Here we go. And I'm going to overwrite the sketch complete. And what I'm going to insert here is exactly the same snippets you saw earlier on my slides. And I use this handy new Windows 10 clipboard here. The first snippet I inserted is to select my features that are intersected by the sketch geometry. So the sketch geometry is passed in as the geometry parameter. I use this to select all features on the current active map. And then I want to do my zoom to, and again, I use my handy clipboard lists. And this is where I zoom to the selection. Again, this is just an API call to operate on the current active map view. I say zoom to this asynchronously. And not sure if you guys have seen the beginning session, but if not, you're probably wondering about this qtask.run. We are actually running this as a background task within ArcGIS Pro. And if you look very closely, if you have any kind of blocking calls, like the select features would be a blocking call, you cannot call any blocking function method calls on the UI. You always have to call them on a background thread. So you would use the qtask.run context for that. And when you do the IntelliSense, you always get that snippet. It says this method must be called on the MCT, use qtask.run. MCT is the main SIM thread, the main cartographic information model thread, which runs all the worker threads in the background. So we pretty much have our code ready. Let's build this. I'm going to do a rebuild my solution. Then I'm going to debug it. If you use our templates, you just click the start button because everything will be configured, the debugger. You can directly step into debugging your add-in. I'm not going to set any breakpoints right here, but we'll do that a little bit later. I just want to show you the functionality. And I'm going to open a map that has some 3D data, which is not always as fast as I would like it. Here's my 2D data. I'm going to, by default, anything that I add without making any changes will appear on the add-in tab, but I can change that. I didn't do it this time. So here's my map tool 1. I click the map tool 1, and you can see the cursor changed. It's probably not visible on that screen. I can actually barely see it on my screen. However, I'm going to digitize this polygon. There we go. It performed the selection, and then it zoomed to the selected set. Now, the reason why you saw the selection not appear before the zoom was because the background threads are all sequential. So when a set is selected, ArcGIS Pro will actually put a task to render the selection symbols into the end of the queue. That's why after the zoom in, the display was refreshed and you saw that the selection symbol appeared. So this is very important in Pro that you use the qtask.run because this ensures always a consistent state of the ArcGIS Pro rendering engine. Now we want to show the same in 3D, so let's take a look at 3D because we use the sketch type output mode screen. So I'm gonna, let me zoom out a little bit. There's a little 3D data set. This comes with our sample data set. And by the way, all the samples you see here, they are pretty much in one or the other form available on our community sample site. So let me just digitize a little polygons around some buildings and trees here. And you can see the zoom to. I selected a factor of 1.5, so that's why it zoomed out a little bit. All right, let me close this. This was the first little demo here. Let's go back to the slides. Okay. Okay, now a little bit about advanced user controls. Any advanced framework elements like DocPane. This is an example of a DocPane right here. We're going to take a look at that later. Pane custom control or embeddable controls This is an example of an embeddable control. Property pages. All these have in common that they use the MVVM pattern, the model view model. That's why it's important for you to understand how to deal with MVVM. It's a little bit, you know, it's a pattern that's requires a little bit extra work, but it has some extra benefits. And in the Pro framework, you have to use our MVVM implementation. So the MVVM implementation in add-ins follows the same pattern used in WPF and .NET. So the model are the classes that represent the data that's consumed by the application. The model is optional in Pro SDK and not stopped out for you. The view is the user interface implemented as a WPF user control using XAML, and it's declared with the config.daml. I'll show that in a second. The view model are the classes that wrap the data coming from the model and provide the business logic for the UI, for the views. And again, this is declared in the config.daml. I will show that in a second. So you implement your add-in UI just as you implement a user control in WPF.NET. So you should get familiar with WPF if you want to become proficient in making advanced user controls in the SDK. You can use many online WPF MVVM snippets. I'll show you one that I used, which I know very little about. But if you search on the internet, many useful snippets are ready for copy and paste, which is always an advantage. So the differences in MVVM for add-ins versus standard out-of-box WPF.NET applications, there's some multi-threading considerations. You know that the ArcGIS Pro SDK is multi-threaded. Also, ArcGIS Pro styling, that's again, so you can blend the look and feel of your add-in into the Pro look and feel. Second demo here. We're gonna open one of these advanced user controls, if I can find Visual Studio. So again, I'm gonna create a new add-in. I'm gonna say new project. Create a module add-in. It will contain nothing. It's just the add-in itself. Now I'm going to use the item template to add, and this time I add a dock pane. I say new item. I drill down to where I can find my Pro dock pane. So this dock pane will inherit from the ArcGIS Pro framework the dock pane base class, hence it will have all its behavior. When we look at the config.daml, you will see it's been modified, a button has been added. That button is only there so you can show the dock pane for the very first time if it's not visible. Once you restart Pro, if you leave your dock pane open, it will still be open for you. And then the dock pane itself has been added under dock panes. You can see we have the dock pane itself. This points to a class where the code behind is located. It's our dock pane 1 view model class. And you can see under the solution, the code has been added, has been stopped out for us. We're going to take a look at that shortly. And then the content itself, the UI, is defined in a class called dock pane 1 view. And this has been stopped out in XAML class for us. So let's take a look at the XAML exec. So this is a standard user control. So you can see the user control tag. There's really nothing in there. By default, our template just puts one header in there. So there's a little header doc panel in there where you can see the heading attribute that's by default stopped out for you. And I'll show in a moment because it's actually kind of handy. I use it a lot for copy and pasting. It's kind of handy to have that. So there's nothing on here. So I'm gonna just use the standard out-of-box WPF controls, and I'm going to add some. I'm going to add a button here. I'm going to use another common WPF control, image, or how about a label? So this is how I define and design my user interface. I can just add things to my XAML. However, we're going to need to add something to the code behind to make this work. We're not going to do this in this demo, we'll do it in the next. So when I look at this, the code behind itself, you can see that the system stubbed out a few attributes for us, including the heading attribute. There is the name of, it says my doc pane by default. I'm going to copy in, this is my heading. There we go. And you can see that's a property. We'll explain how this works a little bit later, but let's rebuild this and run it. So what you should see is we're going to have a button when we open the application. Any kind of project, we'll see the button on our add-in tab. It's funny, Pro takes a lot longer here in the demo room to open than in the practice area. Strange. So here's my button, Show Doc Pane 1. I click it. Here we go. My Doc Pane 1 appears, I guess, by default, it's docked. And you can see the button and the label that I added, the UI elements are there. Standard user control. And that property I changed, this is my heading, has been updated automatically. So let's close this. So this is how I create a project, a doc pane from scratch. So let's talk about some of the MVVM and key concepts you need to know when you program in the Pro SDK. The MVVM pattern separates the user interface definition, the layout, and the design, which is done in XAML, from the business logic, which is in code. So you just saw that I just doing a user interface in XAML. I didn't do any business logic yet, but we'll do that shortly. There is a concept called the data binding, that UI elements in a view are bound by name from the user interface in XAML to properties which are exposed by the view model, the business logic. So here's some examples of that. On the left side, you have the XAML views or the user interface, and on the right side, you have the code behind. So for example, I define a button. Now, if I want that button to do something, I have to specify a command attribute. And then I use data binding. They drop the data, so I just say binding, and I bind it to a name that has to be exposed by my code behind as a property. So on the right side, you see I have a public iCommand property with the same name, retrieve maps command. This is where I put my implementation. That implementation has to implement the iCommand interface. We get into that a little bit in more detail. Next line, we have a text block with a text binding bound to a property called heading. So in the code behind on the right side, I have to provide a public property of the type string, needless to say, that has a getter and a setter with the name of heading. So this is how I changed my heading so it would appear on the user interface. Finally, I'll have a combo box down here, a little bit more complicated because it has a list on a combo box that drops down when you open the combo box. The list is defined in a attribute called item source, and the binding in this case is done to a property called all maps. If I look on the right side in the code behind, I have a read-only observable collection of maps, and it's named all maps. And then the selected item, so when I click on my combo box, I click on one of these items, I bind to a property called selected map. And the selected map, again, you can find as a property, a public property specified in the code behind. So these are the data binding MVVM key concepts. The I command pattern, very important. To bind a button in the UI, you need to bind to a property in your code behind that is an implementation of I command. I command is just a .NET interface, so it's not something that's invented by us. It's invented by Microsoft. And I command requires the implementation of two methods: execute. That's your function that you actually perform your business logic in. And then can execute, returning true or false to make sure you can disable your button if it's not applicable for execution. Relay command is a convenience class, and that convenience class implements the I command interface and allows you to specify the execute and the can execute action functions. So an example, so below we have code behind for a button that we add to a dock pane, and the code behind has a custom behavior implemented using the relay command. So in the code behind itself, I have to specify the I command public property. In this case, I call it fixed zoom in. And I specify in the getter for this property a new instance of a relay command. And the relay command takes two parameters. The first parameter is the execute function. And in this case, I just use a MapView API function. I say, give me the active map view and perform a fixed zoom in asynchronously on this. And then in the second one, I say, well, only if the active map view is actually not null, I can execute this function, because clearly if I have a layout active, then active map view is null, so I don't want to zoom in, and I disable that function at that point. So another example for the I command pattern, I program here my own fixed zoom out button on a dock pane. So what I have to do is I have to add a button to the dock pane to run the fixed zoom out command. So below you see the syntax, you see my button tag added to the XAML. The command attribute has the data binding to the fixed zoom out property in my view model. And then below you can find, we define the referenced I command property in our view model, where we specify in the relay command, again, the map view active fixed zoom out async, and then the same condition that we had before. So this would be a very simple implementation. So you can also use existing pro commands in your code. We went through that in a beginning session, but you can also use these on your user controls, your dock panes, etc. And what you use for that is the Pro Frameworks Get Plugin Wrapper method. You can use it with any Pro Elements ID. You get the iPlugin Wrapper interface, and any kind of command or button will implement the iCommand interface with the execute and can execute. So the programming pattern to use the ArcGIS Pro button functionality in your code would look like something like that. You have the ID of your ArcGIS Pro function. In this case, it's a create bookmark button. Then you specify a framework application, get plugin wrapper with that ID as a parameter, and it will return the iPlugin wrapper interface, which you can cast to iCommand. And then you can check, do I really have an iCommand? And if I can execute that iCommand, then you can actually specify do it with a null parameter. That's a very common pattern. And in the beginning session, we went through some of these issues. How do I find the IDs for the existing functionality? First, you can use our documentation. We have in ArcGIS Pro documentation, we have the DAML ID reference. You can find that on our website. You can see we organized it by extension. So you have the mapping extension here, for example. You can see all buttons, controls, everything that's there. So if I want to do a selection by, or select by, you can see there's, let's say I want to use the existing selection function, I can select by lasso, line, polygon, etc. So this is how you can find existing IDs. However, you can also use our Generate DAML ID tool in Visual Studio. The advantage here is if you have add-ins installed, third-party add-ins, you will get all the DAML IDs for the third-party add-ins as well. And this will allow you to find entries using IntelliSense. The way you find them is you type in your code daml.button.esri_mapping. This would be all the Esri functions. And if you have third-party add-ins installed, the IDs would be, slightly different. Third-party name underscore, whatever, however they name their commands and their buttons. Finally, you can do the same thing in ArcGIS Pro. In the options, you can select under Customize the ribbon. You check the Show Command IDs on screen tips. Once you check that, if you have a tooltip pop up, you can see the ID for that specific tool or button, as shown on the screenshot on the bottom left. So let's take a look real quick at existing commands. And what I did is I used the very same doc pane demo I showed you earlier, where I created a doc pane. But this time I said, well, I'm going to add two buttons. I have a select button that selects features on my map. So I didn't want to implement that functionality with a tool or anything. I just wanted to say, I want to reuse the existing functionality within ArcGIS Pro. So in the button itself, I bound the select functionality to a property called Command CMD Pro Selection Tool. And again, I have a second button here, it's Exit ArcGIS Pro, and I bound this to CMD Pro Close. So when we look at the code behind for this, you can see it's actually very simple. I implement, again, the iCommand interface by just referencing the get plugin wrapper with a proper selection ID. In this case, I use the select by rectangle tool. And I just return it back to the UI. So when the UI queries for my command for the selection, it will just get a reference to the Pro implementation of this tool. For the close, I implemented that second pattern that we showed, where I actually get the plugin wrapper and then I create my own button with my own functionality. However, again, I just use the existing exit application buttons function. So I just execute that what is programmed in ArcGIS Pro already. But, needless to say, I could have my own implementation, my own function, action function specified here. So let's run this real quick and see how this works. Now the breakpoints will occur only once when the user interface queries for the implementation of those buttons. Will occur when I start it up. So let's open a project. There we go, feature test. Okay, this is named Show My Identify. So here we go. So the doc pane was being displayed by ArcGIS Pro, and now the first thing the doc pane did is it queried the system, the code behind, to see if there's an implementation for my selection tool. So I say, yeah, there is an implementation, and we can see it returned the existing iCommand interface back to the UI. The same for the Pro close. You can see we get plugin wrapper. If I look at this iCommand, you can see that it has all the attributes, whatever that come from ArcGIS Pro, including the caption which says exit. So let me continue this. So you can see my identifier has a selection here. I'll move this to the right side here. So if I select, automatically my Pro selection will be used. Again, I've really not coded much. I just referenced existing functionality within ArcGIS Pro. And for the exit, you can see that the Pro functionality with all its in and outs and little dialog boxes, whatever, is being called. So I say in this case, I don't want to save my project, no, and it's closed. So back to the slides. So multi-threading consideration. So this is kind of important because many data elements in Pro are not collected on the UI thread. When collecting data from within QTask.1, which you saw earlier, when we did the zoom in, which is pretty much a worker thread, the special precaution must be taken if this data is used in the UI. So when you update UI user interface collections from a QTask worker thread, locking is required when you share objects across threads. So what is the recommended pattern for updating collections from a worker thread? And this can be found in a .NET implementation in the binding operations helper class. So this is again from Microsoft here. This is not the SDK implementation. And what you use is you use a binding operations.enable collection synchronization call, and you specify your collection and then also a lock object that you can also use in your code to lock access when you want to make updates to that list. I will see that in this next sample. So in the next demo, what we're going to do is we have a drop-down list we populate from the map content. What we do in this case, we want to get all feature layers from the TOC and put it onto our doc pane. Again, this is done from a background worker thread. Since we have to update the UI, we have to deploy that pattern. So what I did is I updated the very same sample I had earlier by adding two combo box. This is a drop-down combo box. The drop-down combo box is bound to two properties. One is the feature layers property, which is the list of all my feature layers. And the second one is the selected feature layer, which I use when I click on it and actually select the feature layer I want. And when I select the feature layer, I want to populate this data grid that's below. And the data grid is bound to an item source called selected feature data table. So what I do here is once I have a feature layer selected, I create a data table with both column definitions and data that I populate with my data I want to display. So let's take a quick look at the code behind. So again, here's my lock collections object. So this object doesn't do much. It just gets created and it sits there to perform just locks. Here's my feature layers observable collection that contains all the feature layers within my map. And then I call this call, this is the pattern that I listed earlier, the Microsoft pattern. I call enable collection synchronization. So this makes sure that my UI doesn't access data from a different thread at the same time when I make updates to it. So we lock this automatically, and then our access from the UI should be safe. This is the selected feature property. So in the setter for this is being called whenever I click on one of the features that I want to select for to display its detailed data. We'll see that when we step through the code. Here's where I populate my feature layers. And you can see I use the lock collections object to make sure that my feature layers are locked before I clear them. I clear the previous data. And then I add new data for each row, to these feature layers, to this feature layer collection. And then finally, this is where I actually display my data. It's a little bit more complicated, but in essence, what I say, get my selected feature layer, the one that I clicked on earlier. I want to, from that, just get the selection, and I want to perform a search. The only purpose for the search is here to get me all the row cursors. So now I have all the detailed data. I step through that, and I populate my data table that I then display in my grid. So let's step through that code real quick. All right. This seems to be getting slower actually with time. There we go. Okay, let me dock this dock pane. All the functionality that I use here, like this docking capability, that's all implemented in the API base class. So now you can see the dock pane is displayed. It wants to populate the list of feature layers. So I curate the attribute, and my system now populates the data. So I have to make sure I lock it because I make updates to this collection to add in all the different feature layers. So we can step through that and just see some of these feature layers. So here's our first feature layer, which is called police stations, and so on. So I'm going to take that breakpoint away. I'm going to run this. So now we can see if we do the drop down here, I have all the feature layers that we have in the TOC for this data set displayed in my drop down list. Now I'm going to perform a selection to select some records. So I have a set of records selected here, which I want to display the details for. So if I say, show me the crimes, so now you can see my selected feature layer will be populated. Let's see what the selected feature layer is. It's crimes, that's what I clicked on, has been selected. And now I go through my selected feature layer, I perform the get selection on that, and I populate my data table in this grid with all the detailed attributes. So I can see each one of these. And I think I actually implemented a flash. When I click on one of these rows, you can see the flash. Again, the sample is available. You can see down here this little chart snippet. This was actually very simple. I never implemented a chart, but I searched on the internet for a chart and then just copy and paste an MVVM chart. So now we dealt with multi-threading issues. This will be when you do more advanced user controls, this will be the trickiest part for you to deal with, is threading issues, multi-threading issues, as compared to Arc objects. Finally, let's deal with styling a little bit. In order for you add into Blend, when themes are toggled, they must be styled correctly. It's not required that your add-ins blend. You can have your own look and feel, but it's desired. When you use the dark and the light themes For graphics, Pro switches between images and dark image folders. We'll take a look at that shortly. We have a style guide for that, which is the Pro style guide. You can find that in the Pro SDK documentation. You can see the dark theme and the light theme in the screenshots below. So let's go this last step. We'll do a little theme implementation. When you look at the config.daml, you see that by default, we stop out the image references. You also notice that you have the images in the images folder, but there's also a dark images folder. The dark images folder is used when you switch your theme. So when your theme is dark, then dark images will be used. So in this case, my dock pane shows this button instead of the light one. And your dock pane itself, you have to use our style guide. When you look at the style guide, you will know that you have to use this dynamic Esri button style for the style. So once I put this in, you can see its look and feel was modified on the UI. Now you have the proper style. If I look at the exit button down here, that exit button doesn't have the proper style. So I'm going to modify that button as well. Paste in the Esri button style, and you can see it modifies it. So the same will happen on your UI, and when you run the application, it will automatically blend in properly with your light and dark themes. Okay, back to the slides, and now I think Uma is up.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start out with the ArcGIS Pro Layouts API. A page layout, simply known as a layout, is a collection of one or more map elements organized on a virtual page designed for a map printing. So there are various layouts supporting elements, such as your title, legend, scale bar, etc. So the layout class in the Pro API, it represents a page layout that you see in your Pro project. You create a layout using the Layout Factory's create layout method. So the layout class provides a collection of basic layout properties and methods. You can use that for your page information, setting page information, such as your dimensions and the unit of measure that you need to use. And it also has some layout element management methods to add and delete elements, and a collection of export methods. Here is a code snippet to create a layout in code. You can see here that I'm using the Layout Factory's create layout method. I'm passing in the dimensions, height and width, and the unit of measure, in this case, inches. And then over here, I'm setting the layout's property using the setName method. So a page layout contains various layout elements. You create these layout elements in code using the Layout Element Factory class. Some of the examples of popular layout elements, common elements, are map frame, your legend, north arrow, scale bar, etc. So here is a code snippet to create a map frame element. So let's step through this. First, I create the layout. I pass in the dimensions, the width, the height, and the unit of measurement. And then I create an envelope to host my map frame. I use the create envelope method, and I pass in the lower left corner and the upper right corner of my envelope. In the next slide, I'm going to show you how you determine these coordinates. And then over here, I'm using the create map frame method. I'm passing in the name of the layout that we just created, the envelope that will host our map frame, and finally, the map that we want to insert into the map frame. And then over here, I'm setting the map frame's name using the setName method. Here in this slide is some information about the coordinate systems that we use in a layout. So here in the screenshot, the lower left corner of the layout is called the origin. It's designated as 0, 0. Notice the map frame over here. The map frame's lower left corner is 4 inches from the left edge and 4.5 inches from the bottom edge. Similarly, the upper right corner is 8 inches from the left edge and 10.5 inches from the bottom edge. So those are the two coordinates I pass to my create envelope method. So this gives me the envelope where I host my map frame. So you can see that here in the last line, the code snippet, I'm using create map frame. I pass in my envelope, pass in my layout, then my envelope that I just created here, and finally the map that I want to insert inside the map frame. Here is just a simple table. I have listed a collection of common layout elements and the associated method you would use in the layout element factory class to create them. So for example, to create a map frame in code, you would use the create map frame method in the layout element factory. It's kind of a reference. Okay, here's a quick demo to show you how to create a layout in code. I have Pro open here. Okay. What happened? Okay. So this is, first let me explain the data set. There's a railroad track and a bunch of rectangular sections which designates inspection areas. So I'm going to zoom into one of these inspection areas and I want to create a layout view of this. So I've already installed an add-in that creates this layout in code. So this is my custom doc pane. And first, I'm going to create some layout specifications. So I'm going to create a layout for my railroad data set. I want the size to be A4 and the orientation to be landscape. So I select that and I'm going to create my layout. This takes me into the code. As you can see here, the first step, I create my layout. I call the create layout method. I pass in the dimensions, the information that I selected in the UI. And then next, I set the layout name, just like we saw in the code snippet. So now I'm going to add some content. First, I want to create a map frame. So for that, I create my envelope. I pass in the lower left corner and the upper right corner. So using the envelope, I create my map frame. And then I go ahead and add a bunch of other layout elements like my scale bar, north arrow, title, so forth. I'm also adding a couple of tables with some information about the inspection locations. Now let's see the result in Pro. So here is a layout that I've completely configured using code. You can notice the layout elements, my map frame, my title, the two tables, a legend, and scale bar and north arrow. Okay. So now let's go back to our slides. Okay. So now moving on now to spatial map series. What is a spatial map series? It's a collection of map pages built from a single layout that represents a geographic area. So a very common type of map series is where each page represents a smaller portion of a larger geographic area. So for example, each page could be a parcel in a larger subdivision. So here on this slide is a conceptual representation of a map series. The layout defines the map composition of every page in your series. And then you have an index layer that represents the grid that helps you generate each individual page. So here in this slide, here are all the API methods and properties you would use when you have to create a spatial map series in code. The important method here is a create spatial map series method. A couple of important parameters that you pass to this method is the index layer. This index layer is used to create a grid for each of your individual map pages. And then the attribute column in your index layer is used to title your each page in your map series. Here is the sort field property. You use this property to uniquely identify each page in your map series. I'm going to show you that in the demo coming up. And then finally, you use the set map series method to set the map series back to your layout. An important point I want to mention here is the spatial map series implements the map series base class. So this inheritance is what controls the way by which you view your individual pages in the layout view. We're going to see that at the end of the demo. So here is a code snippet to create a map series. So first, you begin by defining your index layer. And the next, you create your spatial map series using the map series.create spatial map series method. You pass in the name of your layout, your map frame, the index layer, and the attribute column in your index layer that is used as a title for each of your pages. Here, I'm setting the sort field property. This is used to uniquely identify each map page. This will be very clear when we step through the code in the debugger. And then the last step, we set our map series back to the layout. This slide is just a quick explanation of the data set. Here is my railroad track. You can see my index layer labeled 1 through 11. These are different service or inspection locations. So the idea is that I'm going to create a map series for all these 11 inspection locations in code. So let's see how I do that. Here is a demo. Okay, let me just stop debugging this. And here is my layout sample. I'm first going to build this, and then let's run it in the debugger. I'm going to launch Pro. I'm opening my railroad data set. So let me zoom out so you can see the entire railroad track with the index layer. So the idea is that I'm going to create a map series which will have a series of individual pages with all the 11 service locations. So here in my add-in tab, I'm going to click Generate Map Series. This is my custom doc pane. And just like the first demo, I pick my layout dimensions. I want the map series of the railroad data set, A4 size, and landscape orientation. So now when I create my layout, I step into the code. The first step, I create a layout to hold my map series. Then I pass in the dimensions and my unit of measure. And then I define some content, my map frame, my scale bar, north arrow, so forth, everything configured in code. So now I start defining my map series. So the first step, we create our index layer. I define my index layer. And then I define my map series. I configure it using the create spatial map series method. I pass in these parameters, which is my layout, my map frame, the index layer that is going to be used as a grid for each of my individual pages, and an attribute column in my index layer. So this will be used to label each page on the title. And here I'm setting the sort field property. So here I'm passing in this string, which is another column actually in my index layer. So this uniquely identifies each page. And then the final step, I set my map series back to the layout. So let's run this to see the result. So here in this data grid, you can see my 11 service locations are listed here. And then I can scroll through this to view each map page in the layout view. Notice this is the title. This is one of the fourth parameter that I passed to my create map series method. Here are my tables, my legend, and my map frame with the north arrow and the scale bar. So that's map series. So let's go back to the slides. I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. So hopefully Wolf and I were able to share some good information on mapping and layouts. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.